Good morning, everyone. Before I start, I must acknowledge that in the Bible there is no mention of Mary travelling to Bethlehem on a donkey. Many scholars debate this, but postgraduate Nicole Dupuis hopes that Mary did, as the journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem in biblical times was roughly 90 miles. Bearing in mind that Mary was 9 months pregnant and would need much rest, there is a possibility that the journey took nearer to a week than the suggested 4 days. As all our expectant mums from the fellowship know, by 9 months you struggle to walk 90 yards, let alone 90 miles. So I think it is safe to surmise that Mary did indeed need transport, and in all probability it would have been a donkey. The beginning of this story starts with a young teenage girl full of plans and dreams. She would have been a much-loved daughter and family member, and was betrothed to be married to Joseph the carpenter. Life was wonderful. But God had other plans for Mary. It is easy for us to read our Bibles and see how the story unfolds and what the eventual outcome will be. But Mary didn't have that luxury. All that she could do was trust. She had to trust that the angel that brought the life-changing message to her, and she had to trust that God had a plan already worked out for her. As we know, part of that plan was to travel to Bethlehem, because it was there that the Holy Child would be born. We know Joseph had to make the journey to Bethlehem to register for the census, as that was where his family was from, and we know that Mary had to travel with him. Can you imagine a young teenage girl, 9 months pregnant, having to travel that distance? She would have been scorned and shunned by her family and friends for becoming pregnant. But Joseph, after being visited by an angel in a dream, stood by Mary when others didn't. Can you imagine preparing for that journey, knowing that most certainly you would give birth without your female relatives around you? Mary would have packed her things, making sure that she had everything needed for the baby that had caused all this strife in her life. And yet Mary trusted. The carol I have chosen was written by Eric Boswell in 1959. I think of it as the Marmite of all carols. You either love it or you hate it. If you hate it, it may be because you sang it all through the Christmas season in school. You sang it in the school nativity plays and sang it in the church nativity plays. And, worst of all, you might have even been given the part of the donkey. By now you would have guessed the title of the carol, Little Donkey. But I would like you to close your eyes and imagine the scene that I love. A Christmas card scene, the dark, starry night, Bethlehem in the far-off distance, and Mary sitting on the donkey with Joseph leading. In this scene I can feel peace and serenity that surrounded this little group, the quietness before arriving in Bethlehem, and the despair at finding nowhere to stay, the trauma of being a young pregnant girl and giving birth to her firstborn in a stable with Joseph beside her. And yet she trusted. Little donkey, on the dusty road, got to keep on plodding onward with your precious load. During this journey, Mary had to really learn to trust. She had to trust Joseph, who was leading her. She had to trust God, who had a plan for her. And she had to trust the little donkey that was carrying this precious load. We know nothing of the donkey, whether he was old and cronky and wonky, or maybe he limped with his overgrown hooves, or maybe he was young and feisty. But we do know that Mary had to trust this donkey. This was the donkey that was carrying her and her precious load to Bethlehem. Donkeys are seen as symbols of service, suffering, peace, gentleness and humility. How wonderful to think that God chose this animal for such an important task. He chose an animal that was strong enough to carry Mary on his back for 90 miles, yet gentle enough that no harm came to Mary. He probably provided warmth from his body during the nights to both Mary and Joseph. And yet this is the most humble of creatures. And how fitting that it was the donkey that carried the Holy Child to Bethlehem, and also the donkey that carried Jesus to Jerusalem towards the end of his life. As we enter this season, we all need to be reminded of the peace that God can bring if we trust in Him, just as Mary did.